There has only ever been three films that blew me away on my first viewing that I still feel the same about even to this day. The first is Pixar's The Incredibles, the second is Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame, and the third is Star Trek The Motion Picture. I feel that the characters were really good and the story was amazing. In fact, I found this film to be so engrossing that not even the slow moving scenes annoyed me. Don't get me wrong, I do think that those scenes didn't need to be in the film. But to me, they were more like a heap of dirt on a hidden treasure chest. That doesn't necessarily mean that the film itself couldn't have been improved upon, because due to a tight schedule, not much time was spent on the editing process of the film. But in 2000, Robert Wise, the director of the film, went back to recut it and release it on DVD as Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the director's edition. In addition to the film being slightly trimmed and shorter, there were also some changes done to the visuals and audio that for the most part is an improvement. However, there is one scene that I did not like that they included that wasn't in the theatrical cut of the film. And all I will say is that it's the scene when Spock cries. Yeah, it's as dumb as it sounds, but I still recommend this version over the original. Unfortunately, for some reason, Paramount decided to release the theatrical version on Blu-ray instead. Just a warning if anybody wants to purchase a copy of this film. But even with this recut, there's a lot of people out there that not only think that this movie is one of the bad Star Trek films, but some have even said that it is the worst in the franchise. And when we consider that Star Trek V happens to fall into this equation, it just makes me cringe, and also awfully confused. It kind of makes me wonder if these people have even been paying attention to the film. So I decided to pick out some of these complaints and try to narrow it down to why people dislike this film. Now, I'm not going to mention these reviewers by name because I'm not the kind of guy to go and point fingers at people and say how stupid they are, but if any of you have seen some of these reviews, you may recognize some of the stuff that I will be mentioning. I would also like to mention that not all reviewers have made these statements, okay? Alright, so here's the first criticism that the film gets, and probably the most common. The movie has a lot of special effects, but it is too slow and has very little substance to it. I'm paraphrasing here because many reviewers have made the statement about Star Trek: The Motion Picture, but to the point, I don't agree with this statement. If Star Trek: The Motion Picture truly did have so little substance and content to talk about, then why did it take me 40 minutes to talk about it? Star Trek: The Motion Picture not only has a complex story that many of these reviewers oversimplify, but they also seem to be completely oblivious to all the subplots that are sprinkled throughout the film. There was even one reviewer that complained that Spock was too emotionless and distant than in other Trek films. Obviously, if you have seen part 2 of my review, we all know that there is a subplot reason for this. In other words, that individual was not really paying attention. But to the same people that complained about Star Trek being too slow with very little content to show, many of them happen to also make this next statement. It's a lot like 2001: A Space Odyssey, but it will never be as good. You are a hypocrite. 2001 was so excruciatingly slow, it is to this day the only science fiction film that I stopped watching, simply because it was just too boring for me to handle. But I'm not saying that anybody that liked the film is stupid or anything like that. That's not the point. The point is, people are condemning Star Trek for something that it had little of, whilst at the same time praising 2001 for that very same thing that it had a lot of. We don't see much of the crew, like Scotty, Sulu, Uhura, and Chekhov. That is actually a good thing. I don't think these characters should be shoehorned into a story just because they were there in the original series. Let's face it, they were mostly there for cosmetic reasons, just to keep fans of the original series happy. The film needs to keep its focus on our 4 main characters: Kirk, Spock, Decker, and V'Ger. Yes, even Bones doesn't have much of a role to play, and you know what? That's fine, because although it is tradition to give these characters bigger roles in these movies, sometimes tradition can hurt a film, especially if that film is trying to do something very unconventional and specific. It's kinda like Toy Story. The movie's not actually about all of Andy's toys, but mostly focused around Woody and Buzz. By the way, I did not forget about Ilia. I didn't mention her because she isn't really even in this film. Just as we started to get to know her, she then falls under the control of V'Ger. Through most of the film, she acts more like an extension to V'Ger, being the eyes, ears, and voice of V'Ger. There is not enough character drama. Uh-huh. I'm not kidding. Someone actually said that in a review. The movie looks stupid. Everyone's wearing brown and beige, with the interior of the ship being brown and olive green. I do agree with this. The interior of the ship, as well as the colors and the onesies that a lot of people are wearing, look silly. But here's the reality. Old films that depict a future are going to look dated and typical of its time. I'm not saying movies can't avoid this, but the question we really should be asking is, how does the story hold up? Or how about the characters? Or the cinematography? What about the music? Etc. I'm not dismissing that the cosmetics haven't aged well. It's just that things like that really doesn't matter to me. This film isn't character driven, but just throws effects at the audience. Can somebody please explain to me how the stuff I talked about in the last 3 videos isn't character driven? For Pete's sake, I didn't even have time to mention the effects in the film. I think I'm gonna stop here. You guys get the point. After reading and watching the many reviews that people had for this film, with the exception of it being boring for some, I noticed something very bizarre. Many criticisms are inconsistent and extremely varied for each reviewer. In other words, almost everyone had completely different reasons to hate this film. It almost seems like that these people are scrounging for reasons wherever they can find them. I get it. You guys don't like the film. And that's fine. As I stated in the prologue, film is an art, and art is subjective. But the thing that's bothering me is that when I read a negative review about a film that I happen to like, most of the time I can see why people didn't like the film. Some people would say Hunchback of Notre Dame was too mature and dark for its target audience. Speed Racer is too colorful and frantic for the average viewer. These criticisms makes sense. But in the case of Star Trek the Motion Picture, many of these people that don't like the film get carried away to the point where they nitpick or downright fabricate the problems that don't actually exist in the film. Just admit that you don't like this film because it has some slow-moving scenes, that it isn't like the original series, that the bridge is colorless, that the stupid twang annoys you, that everybody looks like they're wearing tight zip-up pajamas, and that you don't get to see much of the original crew. But as for me, these problems that the film had just simply doesn't matter enough. Now, I like Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, but I like it for different reasons. Star Trek II is a fast-paced, swashbuckling action-adventure with themes of revenge, loss, ethics, and many other things. Star Trek the Motion Picture is the complete opposite. It is a sweeping science fiction epic with themes of mystery, soul-searching, tolerance, discovery, and many other things. These two films could have not been more different from each other, and that probably explains why people that are fans of the sequel don't like the original. Because future Star Trek films would follow the formula of the sequel and original series, more so than the first film, does that mean that those that aren't really crazy about the Star Trek franchise as a whole would like Star Trek the Motion Picture more? I think that may be true. A funny thing happened while I was working on these series of videos. I discovered that more recently, more and more people are praising Star Trek the Motion Picture than in the past. Although Star Trek the Motion Picture is the black sheep of the series, the film on its own works. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't work as a Star Trek film. I do think that this film does do things that Star Trek is best at. It explores ideas that have a strong emphasis in philosophy, religion, and science, which is more than I can say for other installments in the franchise, especially when those films pretend to have intelligent ideas that just come off as pretentious. I can go on and on, but I'm out of time. All I will say is this: Star Trek the Motion Picture isn't a perfect film. In fact, I'm not even sure if such a thing even exists. But watching this film for the first time was an unforgettable experience. Not only do I find this to be probably my most favorite Star Trek film to date, but perhaps even my most favorite science fiction film of all time.